Welcome to joint Senate and House briefing this evening. It's Monday night. We've been addressing our Senate and House bills in the respective chambers. This is the last night to hear Senate bills in those chambers, and now we have to switch tomorrow. Passed out the budget bill. We've got some statistics on bills passed. Last year at this point we'd passed 236 bills. As of tonight, just a few minutes ago, we'd passed 257 bills. We're also here to probably discuss, I'm assuming, alcohol policy. No, maybe it's tax policy tonight.
We can talk about all the things that are on.
We discovered today that the volatility of the food tax restoring the food tax wasn't as great as we thought it was. We had a revelation on that today. I had some information come from our fiscal analyst office, and so we've decided to suspend our efforts in restoring the food tax and send the issued interim of broadening the bases and lowering rates, and maybe we'll come back with next session more educated. We'll continue to look at our transportation bill and some other bills that are some tax changes, but they are going on separately. And we have the speaker here. Speaker, welcome to this briefing, and Representative Spenlove, as well as our minority leader and members of the Senate majority leadership. So questions now from the media.
Can you talk about what information you received that changed everyone's mind? Maybe both of you and the speaker?
I'll just briefly and then turn some time over to the speaker. There was some charts done with regards to volatility. We had some charts actually from the state auditor, Dougal, that shows that there is volatility there, but we thought that the volatility was greater than, and the reason why this was a big issue for us is that we wanted to reduce that volatility, and where there's not significant volatility, we thought that the current system we have is probably just as good as one that we might pass.
Yeah, I appreciate the President inviting us to this media availability. This was something that we embarked on. It might have felt late in the session to many, but I know that the President has been working at, I think from the beginning, I hate to speak for you, but there had been a lot of work done on this front. And the House, as we went over this, we were in the session, we went to our caucus in the House and said we think there's some opportunities to reform our tax formulas and how we as a state collect revenue, because we see there's some pinch points coming in the future, and we had the political will to absolutely do that. And so then we let good information drive good decisions, and as has been noted, that the whole reason to do this was to try and take those peaks and valleys out of the way state revenue is collected. And it's hard to have in surplus years funding things, and then when the economy slows down, yo-yoing that away. And so those are concerns. And so anything that could add stability to that base or broaden the base was something that I know certainly in the House we had the political will to explore and hopefully pass. And but as we looked at this data, and we all worked on this over the weekend. Yeah, it just had to come to a point, and I am incredibly disappointed, because this is something that I know on a policy level we have the political will to do, to commit to the heavy lifts and to make those changes, but the data doesn't bear out that we would be addressing the peaks and valleys or the volatility of our sales tax to any degree, really. And we felt comfortable that politically we had addressed how to mitigate the impact of the least amongst us and those of low income, not just with this bill, but with a lot of efforts happening in this session and found within our budget with the homeless, with our justice reform. We have an assessment for these the Homeless Resource Center. So we thought as a package, we were really looking towards and making sure that this would not impact those of a lower household income. But the data didn't show us that we were going to mitigate some of what was driving the conversation in the first place. So I'm disappointed that we're not going to do it. We put a lot of work into it, but at the end of the day, you have to reflect why you're doing it and why you would be willing to make those changes. And if you're not convinced that you're getting that advantage, then you have to be big enough to say as much. So we're not going to be doing that.
So we want to thank, though, our staff who have worked over the weekend, worked tirelessly as we were trying to come to some conclusions on this tax policy. I want to thank those who worked hard on it, like Representative Elison and Representative Spenlove and the Speaker. We worked very hard on this, and it's not for naught. Because we've discovered some very important things for us as we address the needs for tax structure going forward for our state. As I've mentioned here many times, we're going to double in population over the next 30 years, and our infrastructure needs are enormous to meet that demand. And so this is not over. We still have those same problems that are projected by our fiscal analysts. Problems that we could face here in the next even 3 to 4 years, potentially. And so I think this is now just the beginning of a discussion. We've discovered that restoring the sales tax back on food isn't going to create, while it does lessen the volatility, it doesn't significantly lessen the volatility. So now if that's an issue, we can take off the table and we can look at other things. Auditor Dougal suggests in his data that the reason why we've had a shrinking general fund is that we've been earmarking general fund for transportation. And that's, I think that's got to be a discussion going forward if we're going to stabilize the general fund. And then there's also the hope that Congress can act or we find some other way through voluntary compliance agreements or otherwise to collect online sales tax, because that's a base that we are losing with people buying more things online. So those are some areas that I think that we'll be focusing on in the future.
So on that issue though, I mean, what is going to get looked at then this session, or is nothing going to get looked at? Are the Senate just tweaked the gas tax formula, so that's done. But what about income tax? What about sales tax reduction?
None of those.
All of it's gone?
Yes.
Okay.
So the sales tax on groceries is only just slightly less volatile than the overall
That's correct.
sales tax?
Mhm.
How did we
The reason
find out?
why it actually is a lot more stable, but it's such a small percentage of the total sales tax. That's what we were missing.
It doesn't balance out the rest of it.
That doesn't balance out the rest of
Yeah.
it. That was the difficulty. It's only 11% of all tax, sales tax brought in. And that was the thing that was revealed today, and thankfully, we found that out today before we jumped off that cliff and did that. And while that still would have been good tax policy, we decided, why are we doing that when we're not going to get a substantive improvement in the base? And we have an economist here that could actually maybe weigh in.
By way of background, Representative Spenlove was part of the Governor Huntsman's staff. He's an economist and was his policy advisor when we went through our tax reform in 2007, and was intimately involved in that process. And so he and our Revenue and Taxation Chairman, Representative Elison, our only CPA in the House, those two really spearheaded this effort, and they did that deep dive that we needed to do on this. And so, Robert, if there's anything you wanted to mention.
Sure, I think this really is an example of the process working right. It's an example that, and to the credit of our leadership, they set forth to look at this issue, to really analyze what needed to be done, and said, let the data drive our decision. So we We looked at everything. We looked at the different areas. We looked at income tax, the sales tax. We were looking at different mechanisms to try to solidify the system and really prepare our taxes for the future. And just like President Niederhauser and Speaker Hughes said, we do have a situation that we need to be addressing. We do have a deficiency in our ongoing needs and our ability to have the revenue to provide for those needs. And so we've got to be spending the time to really understand what we need to do to address this deficiency. And so what we did over the past few weeks was really dig into these different areas and try to address what we could do to address the situation this year. And like I said, the data really drove our decision. And once you have a result, and it was really looking at that, it was that volatility analysis. While it does reduce the volatility, it doesn't reduce it dramatically enough to be able to justify making that change right now. So we said, well, we're not gonna, this isn't the end of the process, it's really just the beginning. If you remember back last time we did substantive tax reform, it took 3 years. And it took the legislature focusing all of its efforts on this issue because it's difficult to do. And by the way, before 2000, so we started in 2005, and then we did more in 2006 and finished in 2007. Before that tax reform of 5, 6, and 7, the last time we reformed the tax system was 1947. So it had been about a generation since we had reformed the tax system. And so I really, again, want to commend leadership for this commitment because it needs to be done. We need to be focusing on this, and we do have that commitment to be trying to find the right solutions for the future.
So what was the dollar figures like?
But let me just, before you ask another question, but let me just, I think this is an important element to this discussion as Representative Spindler has talked about how long it took us to do tax reform back in 2005 to 2007, and then I think there was even a little bit of cleanup the year afterwards. Yeah. Things have changed for us. We've given our fiscal analysts tools. They can run scenarios that took us months to do back in 2005 and 2006. They can do them in a day. So that's the difference today versus a decade ago. Amazing what technology has done, which actually helps us to drive good policy because we have that data and the ability to analyze that data so quickly. And our fiscal analyst is able to take real tax data that we have, that they're deputized to be able to utilize because that's private information, but they can run scenarios through that tax data, and we have almost real-time information. We just need to know what to ask, and so we're learning what questions to ask, and through some of that questioning over the last few days, we made some discoveries, and that's why we're here tonight.
And this is part of the process.
Yeah, it
This
is.
is exactly how it's supposed to
Nobody
be.
thought to ask until today if it would actually stabilize the overall sales tax collection?
Well, we knew it would. The data shows that it would,
The
but we
food
just
taxes
didn't know
were
how,
stable.
we hadn't looked at how much in comparison. And when we saw that actual comparison, when it was not as significant as we thought,
Right.
we thought that,
But did nobody ask before, or
No.
did somebody just finally get around to looking? I mean, why today?
There's a lot of deep dives. One of the things that I think we focused on was how do you mitigate any impact to the low income? So we looked at great models that are out there. Idaho has a great grocery tax credit. We studied that. We wanted to understand, is that something we could implement here in the state of Utah? An earned income tax, a state earned income tax credit for those within intergenerational poverty. We were really centered on a lot of the areas that potentially could impact low-income households. There takes time and there takes research on those fronts. And so there's a lot of effort going on. There's a lot of data, a lot of work that happened with Representative Elison and I spent time over the weekend on charts and on process. And so it's not that anyone forgot to ask any questions. There's just, with the time that the session is inherently a fast track, And with all that we were getting together to answer those questions and to get this right, as we looked at once we felt like we got some of the other aspects right, like mitigating the impact to the low income, as we started to then model this out, we weren't satisfied that we were seeing the volatility wasn't being addressed to the degree that we had hoped. And so that's, I think we found it faster than they would have found it in the past. And so I'll tell you this, the thing that I regret the most is I absolutely believe that politically we can address any policy issue. We have the political will to do something like this. And so we can overcome a lot, but I can't overcome math. So,
Did we not
and
know
that's
that
where
it's only 11%? Do we not know that today?
So
I mean,
what
that's
you
I'm
do
understanding.
when you're considering tax changes, you run what's called scenario analysis. So you look at different scenarios. It's almost kind of like pulling different levers, and each lever has a different impact. And so what we're doing was we were running these scenario analyses, and there's many different options on the table. So when you look at tax reform broadly, you have the property tax, sales tax, income tax, gas tax are just the big ones. There are lots of smaller ones too. And then you look at the impact on family size, on income, on housing characteristics, and there's all these different areas that you're looking at. So what we were doing was we were analyzing all the different scenarios, and what you do is you say, okay, is making this change going to have the impact that we're hoping, and is this change coupled with this one going to have the impact? And so that's what we've been doing, is just doing all these different scenario analyses. And as we did them, you just kind of come up with, you have kind of a hypothesis that you're trying to test. And the hypothesis we're trying to test is volatility significantly influenced by these changes? So that was always the hypothesis we're working towards. And as we're testing different things, you kind of have your null hypothesis. And so we weren't able to prove that hypothesis to the degree that we'd hoped to. And so that's why you come up with the results.
And let me say,
So
we
did-
didn't stumble across this information.
Yeah.
You have to know what you're going to plug in long-term to know what you're going to get. And so it was always going to be the case that we would be staring at the longer range and putting them out there. But we had to understand what it is that we wanted to implement overall. And so that's,
And I
and
think-
remember, just even a few days ago, we were looking at income tax as part of this. which
Well, I
could have
mean,
been an
this
offset.
initiative or this proposal that we were looking at, we just gelled on that on Friday.
Yeah.
So,
And it doesn't change the long-term goals. We still need to address
no.
the issue.
Okay.
And sales tax and restoring sales tax on food does stabilize the
Yeah.
base in those times when we go into recession. But when we found that the significance wasn't what we thought it was, we've got studies from the Tax Review Commission from several years ago, all of these indications, and it's almost intuitive that people are buying food during a recession, but they're not buying as many cars and furniture. So that's a reality. It's just not as significant as we thought it was going to be, and that drove us to decide that our tax system, as far as this part, the restoring of the sales tax back on food, is probably okay. And by doing that, we're not implementing another grocery tax. We already have the sales tax back off on food, and so we just felt like the system that we have now is, probably a little more volatile than the other one, but probably not significant enough for us to address it.
So you talk about, a lot of the data driving this decision. What about public feedback? Because it seems like the idea of hiking the food tax was certainly not very popular. At least I know that there was a lot of people expressing a lot of anger about this. Did that drive any of your decision?
Not for me anyway. I'm not going to speak for members of the House, but for me particularly, I felt that this was an important issue. I know what crossroads we have to face here in 3 to 4 years. And if this was a policy that would help us, I wanted to move forward. We're going to set up a public hearing tomorrow night to make sure we've had public input on it. But like I said in press availability today, this isn't a new concept. This isn't the first time we've discussed this. We have the Tax Review Commission report. the Senate has addressed this many times in time past, and we've been studying it for years. So it isn't something that just came up during this session.
I know you said you didn't necessarily stumble across this, but that you've been working for a long time. Why, I guess right now, are we just getting this, or did this data make you change? If you've been working on
Yeah,
it so long.
when we discovered some of the data that we hadn't seen today, this drove the idea that, you know, as far as this area of the tax code, our tax structure, we're probably just as good as, we're good with the system we have today. But it's not over. We've got to address a shrinking general fund, and that's either through online sales tax, restoring some of the, dealing with transportation funding and releasing some of the earmarks in for transportation in the general fund. At least that's what Dougal, our Auditor Dougal is at least arguing. We got his data today. That's something we can't process. Probably will have to look at during the interim. But those are some issues in broadening that base, and we need to do that. So
So do you-
we're going to have to address this.
Do you see this maybe as back on the table, maybe as a broader tax reform next year or the year after?
Yeah, it might take this year and into the next year to do that, to make sure, well, the interim's gonna look at earmarks and credits and so forth, and that will give us a basis, I think, for, we'll know exactly where that volatility is and how we can stabilize it.
And I know that Idaho's talked about getting rid of their tax credit system, but I know you said that you also looked at that. Does that play into your decision whether or not to adopt that, considering Idaho in the last couple of years has thought about scrapping theirs?
Well, if we're not restoring the sales tax back on food, we're definitely not gonna do a grocery tax credit.
So
I'd
is
like
that
to answer
off the
Ben's
table?
question. You asked a question, Ben. I just want to say that to the extent that perception would drive our decision, that would not be the case in the House. We would not let a negative perception of the decisions to reform our sales tax collection drive that. But to the extent that the concerns that were out there, we did discuss those. And I think you saw it in the plan that was shaping up and the one that was coming forward. We're addressing the legitimate concerns that we were hearing, and they were legitimate. But if we're addressing those to the degree that we believe we are, and we would not let we wouldn't let the negative perception beyond that maybe stop our progress. So again, politically, I believe we have the political will to do it. Just we didn't have the plan.
How much money are we talking though? When you say that you got this numbers back, do we have some ballpark numbers about how much you were hoping to get from the food tax, but then when it didn't come together? I mean, do we have any?
The numbers really are there, and that's not the issue. We have all the numbers. It was, are we addressing the structural problems, the volatility? And yes, we were, but not to the degree we thought we were going to. And again, I'm just saying that we decided that it didn't address it in a substantive way as substantively as we thought, and so we decided we would leave that policy alone.
Are you going to bring it back next year?
Well, we're probably going to bring some issues back next year because our Revenue and Taxation Committee is going to look at some of the volatility issues, the credits, the exemptions.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to look at earmarks and those types of things so that, you know, we have, but you know, once we have that data, and it's easy to get that data today, and it's easy to model it, and it's amazing how fast we can do it. But then, you know, we've got to take that and somehow put it into public policy.
Is food tax off the table at this point?
This year.
Can people be assured, or just this year?
Yeah.
Despite finding that the volatility
My guess
isn't
is,
there.
least you know that nothing's ever off the table going forward.
People
But
want assurances.
our discovery this year, I think it would be remote, that at least I'd be supporting us doing that, because it doesn't get us where we thought we were gonna get, where we're going.
All that early modeling was, I mean, were you guys factoring in income tax and other changes too? Is that why we just didn't get these numbers till today, because it wasn't isolated?
Yeah, that's good, yeah, that's,
And just to be clear, a Republican administration with an economist who is now a Republican state lawmaker, I know the modeling was different, that you didn't have the same quick access to models and data. But you had to look at volatility back then, right? And you must have been assured that you weren't hurting the sales tax base in a significant way by giving people these. This tax break.
The argument in 2006 and 7 with removing the sales tax on food was not about a volatility reduction. It was essentially just a change to help lower income individuals. So there was,
the food tax was regressive, and it was one that it was more of a political consideration. I remember it as.
Yeah.
at least.
Income tax reform.
income tax was the real reform.
That's where the reform was, and in order to address the middle to low income, we brought in the sales tax off of food.
Yeah. But
And so
the,
you didn't look at volatility on the sales tax then, which seems like something
I
you
don't
always
remember us
want to
doing
be
that.
aware of. But I'm talking about the administration now. I'm asking you to put your old hat on.
in terms of tax policy,
Mhm.
I can tell you that when we were, when the proposal was to remove part or all of the sales tax on food, there was criticism of it, that it was not good tax policy. So if you look at it just from a purely policy standpoint, it's probably not the best policy to narrow the base. And so that's kind of what was driving the opposite now is, if it probably wasn't the best policy 10 years ago, then conversely, it's probably better policy to be restoring that. Because the principle that is kind of overarching on all this is good sound tax policy is based on trying to broaden the base. You want the broadest possible tax base so you can lower that rate. And that's kind of what's driving this. And I still believe that's true with what we've been working on this whole year, is trying to find the best tax policy. But then the question is, to what degree is it advancing those policy goals?
Representative Evenson, do you have any other
Yeah, I
comments?
did, as a follow-up to Ben's question, volatility in any given quarter could be up to 8 figures. It was still significant. However, I believe when you did tax reform last time, was it hundreds or thousands of different models that were run, Robert?
It was literally thousands. We did
Okay.
about 3,000 different models.
So every day, since we've
Or
started
scenarios.
this discussion in depth, we've had numerous models being run. This morning, additional ways to look at it. And under the current scenario, the lowest income brackets would have actually benefited greatly, potentially, from this change in terms of percentage increase to their annual, income. Not huge dollars, but a decent percentage change. So they were being held harmless. Leadership felt very strongly about that. And the volatility is there. The graphs show it. But the question would just be is it enough at this point without further analysis to determine the magnitude of it to move forward without additional study? And I anticipate in interim revenue tax will continue to look at that and look at ways to solve the base problems that we are trying to deal with. One important point to note, in our current budget, there is a move to restore dental benefits to disabled adults. That was cut during the recession. It's taken us this long to restore that, and 34,000 people will benefit. Well, if we don't address the volatility in the general fund, we can plan on the next recession, which may only be 2 years away, if the past is any indicator of the future. We may be looking to have to make those tough cuts again. And at the end of the day, that's what leadership and myself were trying to do, was stabilize those numbers so we didn't have to make some of those difficult cuts.
Senator Adams?
Yeah, I think that was the basis of the report from the Tax Review Commission. And I actually think we ought to take the data that we have today and review what they recommended back in 2009 and see if somehow we're missing something and actually compare the two. there's just probably not enough time in the last few days of the session, so it sounds like something we ought to do during it.
We'll just take a couple more questions and then we can talk offline.
I was gonna say, because one of the things you mentioned when you talk about your tax models is the online sales tax and how much that's eating into the budget. And I know that, you know, you guys have made some deals with Amazon, but not all online purchases are made on Amazon. How significant of a change would it make if you were able to collect online sales tax? Would you be having the issues you have or having to have the discussions you're having about food sales tax and others?
Well, I think that we're going to have a lot of discussion because we're gonna make this, we're gonna meet a crossroads here in the next, like I said, 3 or 4 years, maybe it's 5 or 6 years, depends on the economy and tax revenues. And like I mentioned to a couple of our senators today, we have to look at all possibilities, and it may be looking at how we deal with transportation funding different. So to free up some of that base that we're spending on transportation in the general fund, or what would otherwise be general fund.
Mhm.
And we also have to look at the expanding the base that we're losing on online sales. So it's gonna take all of that, in my opinion, and we need to look at all those things, and so I can't close the door on sales tax on food until we've looked at all of those issues. But the discovery we've made over this afternoon, about noon today, it was, I think, after we met for press availability, was it gave us pause. It was significant enough to give us pause, and let's make sure we're doing this right.
So on the internet issue, is that bill dead? Because it made it over to a House committee, and I believe both remote sales tax collection bills failed to pass out of the House.
Yeah, I don't think that's, but Senate Bill 110 doesn't increase the base.
Sure, but you're saying
It's-
that's a bigger issue you gotta look at, but
Yeah,
the bills you have aren't making it.
Right, and so we're gonna have to look at how we're going to do that, because it really isn't in our power, other than pushing on the federal government to do something, which is what SB 110 does, is put some pressure on them, and if more states do that, I think we get to a solution nationwide, which would be important. And that's the importance of that bill. But it doesn't expand the base immediately. It's something that's gonna have to happen. Now, Senator Harper's bill, that I guess I didn't know that it didn't pass out today.
5-5 failed.
But that actually reaches out, and it's kind of like a 1099, where we ask those online vendors to send us those who are purchasing online, and then we can ask them to pay their use tax, which they're obligated to pay anyway. So all those things I think are on the table. We got to find a way, but I'm very encouraged by the Tax Commission. I appreciate Commissioner Valentine and the commissioners and the Tax Commission for entering into these voluntary compliance agreements. I think we can make a lot of headway just doing that. And the extra revenue that we had when we had our February forecast, I think much of that in the general fund was attributed to these VCAs.
Can we talk
And
And
process
just real quick,
here?
and one of the issues that I think we need to be addressing is the fundamental disconnect with our tax system and our economy. So our tax system is based on a 50-year-old notion of a goods-based brick and mortar economy. What we've got now is a service-based online economy, and we've got to adjust our tax system to reflect the changes in the economy.
What's just the Democrats' response to everything that's happened today?
I think we're quite encouraged that the sales tax on the food did not go forward. And we're looking forward to a good discussion and debate during the interim to look at these exemptions. And we want good tax policy. We want to push for good tax policy. We pushed for many, many years to get the sales tax off food. So it was really very difficult to try to support putting it back on. And I think the one thing is this gives us a time to really step back, look at those different modelings. The Fiscal Analyst's Office has some great tools that we can all take a look at and model different ways of addressing this problem. and what's there. And so we've got some time to be able to do that. And I think this year, taking a look at the issues on rev and taxation and the interim committee's studies is going to give us a lot of information to begin next session. And then if this is a 2-year program, which we're discussing tonight, then that'd be something that we can address other issues. We've got to find stability in our tax structure in the state of Utah.
Can we talk process
Let's just
briefly?
do one more question.
We had a situation where, and Speaker Hughes, if you could answer this just quickly, process, a lot of this, all of this was done behind the scenes. We would get updates on what was being discussed, but would you be in this position if you'd gone through a regular process and put together a
yeah,
proposal and
Lisa,
debated
this
it
is,
publicly?
this is a 30-something actual workdays in a 45-day session. And if we had come together on a plan, there would have been public hearings and there would have been the same process that all these bills have. We are late in the session, but that is not unique to the difficult legislation. I've been here many sessions where some of the toughest bills are still being negotiated, even on the last night, and we're not close to that right now. So it's an inherently fast-track process, given we're the one branch of government that gets 30-something workdays a year, not the entire year. So I think the process has been followed as it always is.
Yeah, and I want to reemphasize our discussion today at noon in press availability is that we've been very transparent about what we were discussing. And you knew exactly what we were dealing with as we knew it. And I want to emphasize that even in 2007, after 3 years of study, it came together on the last 3 nights of the session.
But in that bill a decade ago, the food
Because
tax
it's
was in
that
there.
deadline, that midnight on the 45th night, that gets the legislature to
But
act.
you
So,
have said
thank
that
you
that
very
it was
much.
just.
Thank you guys, that's it.
I gotta go. Thanks.
Thank you.